Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, which also provide you the much important avenue to practice daily answer writing, in the first topic, we'll try to analyze the driving factors for the increasing cases of suicide among youth in our country and what the government has done to strengthen the mental health care infrastructure in our country. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to analyze the argument which has been given by the central government in the apex court of the country that the court shall not treat governors as aliens on whom timeline shall be imposed. Then, from your simplified section, we'll take up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide you the much important value addition, keeping in mind the approaching Mains 2025. So, stay tuned. The article today in Indian Express highlights the growing issue of suicide among the youth of our country due to various socio-economic factors, which is significantly denting the idea of India's demographic dividend. Suicide, which is untimely and tragic loss of life, which actually becomes more devastating for the family as well as more perplexing for the socio-economic fabric of the country. Because it basically implies that the state has been unable to enforce and prevent the fundamental right to dignified life which has been guaranteed under the Article 21 of the Constitution to its people. Just imagine a 24-year-old student pursuing B.Tech actually committing suicide and thus giving up on the best gift which is offered to us by the life, that is will of living altogether. Why? Because he was unable to actually withtake the stress and the pressure anymore. This fellow student's life which we have lost, this particular student also formed an integral part of the idea of demographic dividend, which we very often hear and see in the news very oftenly. So what is this glorious demographic dividend which our country is having right now? So if we refer to the State of World Population Report 2023, according to it, our country's current population stands at around 142.8 crore people, of which almost 68% of the population actually falls in the working age bracket, that is from 15 to 59 years, and this basically constitutes the India's demographic dividend, where basically we have a large labor force which is either in the working age, in seeking of the work, various kind of works in the service sector, manufacturing sector, agriculture sector, etc. And thus there exists a low dependent population on this wage earning population. What is this dependent population? The population which belongs to the age of children 0 to 14 years or the population above the age of 60 years, the term which we call as silver economy. So for example, if we compare ourselves with the developed nations, let's say for example Japan and Austria, their population which is above 60 years of age, that is silver economy, that itself has become almost 50% of their population. Thus, their labor output has significantly declined over the course of years. At the same time, when we are saying that we have such a large labor force, which is, let's say for example, earning wages on daily and monthly basis, don't you think that they basically have high propensity to consume as well? And thus there exists a huge domestic demand for the various kind of consumer durables. To understand this, we can refer to the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey 23-24, according to which the share of private consumption in India's nominal GDP, it actually rose from being 55% in the year of 2020 to almost 62% in the year of 2024. So basically there exists a huge demand which is actually being caused by the huge propensity to consume, which is actually being driven because there is a large working age population which is earning wages. So when there exists such a huge demand for consumer durables, don't you think it basically acts as an incentive for the industries to actually produce more products? Thus, to produce this more products, don't you think there is actually requirement of more labor, more land, more, let's say for example, other factors of production, and thus there exists higher employment level in our country in comparison to the past. Now let's say for example there is a particular region, and in this region there is existing a huge demand. Why? Again, because of the huge employable population. So don't you think that over a period of time, as the demand is increasing, the industries will start creating in this region itself, and that will lead to the industrialization of the region. As the industries are increasing, the employable population is increasing, their propensity to consume is increasing, the private investment in this particular region will increase as well. At the same time, the government investment will actually increase in the form of capital expenditure to actually create more roads, more railway networks, to actually create, let's say for example, more public institutions in this region. At the same time, there exists high propensity to consume. So it is a very profitable region for various kind of economic ventures. So don't you think social capital will start increasing in the form of creation of more hospitals, more schools, and thus rapid urbanization of that particular region will take place. So that is basically the estimate of Niti Aayog, according to which almost 50% of India's population is going to live in the cities by the year of 2047, the idea of Viksit Bharat. And thus over a period of time, we are actually going to transition away from the agriculture based economy which we have. Because even today, agriculture remains the largest employer, with employing almost 46% of the workforce as per Economic Survey 2025. Thus, over a period of time, with transitioning away from this agriculture-based economy and rapid urbanization, it basically implies that there will take place more innovation and entrepreneurship. Thus, basically transformation of Industry 4.0 to Industry 5.0. Then when sociologists refer to this particular phenomena of demographic dividend and rapid urbanization which is taking place, they basically kind of interpret that the total fertility rate is actually declining as well. So for example, our total fertility rate, which is basically the number of children which a woman can bear in her productive age, that is basically come down to 2.1. That is very close to the replacement rate. So that basically implies that with this declining total fertility rate, we can say, if we look at from the gender lens, that the women are actually getting more healthier because they have to now bear less children. They are getting actually more educated, and there are more fewer care responsibilities which are actually being imposed upon them. Thus, the increasing human capital of the woman is also taking place. So basically we can say that this rising youth population or demographic dividend in the working age actually act as a kind of an asset for our country. But this is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin actually shows a more grave picture or serious picture. For example, if we refer to the report which was published by the National Crime Record Bureau called as Student Suicide, an Epidemic which is Sweeping India 2024, it provides us a data by the Ministry of Social Justice, according to which from the year of 2019 to 21 itself, more than 35,000 students actually committed suicide. And thus, the report says that the India's student suicidal rate has actually surpassed the overall trend as well as the population growth rate itself. So, for example, the population between 0 to 24 years actually witnessed a decadal decline, where the population between 0 to 25 years was 582 million in the year of 2011, and that significantly declined to 581 million in 2024. You might be surprised to know that India is actually considered as the suicide capital of the world, where if we refer to the Lancet report, the kind of the number of suicides which are being committed in the world, the female suicide death, India actually contributes to 36% of the global suicide, and in the male suicide death we almost contribute 24%. So a question which shall be arising in your mind at this stage should be, what are the factors which are driving this silent epidemic? To understand that, let's first understand a term which was coined by the principal economic advisor to the Prime Minister, Sanjeev Sanyal, in the year of 2024. where he said that the youth of our country is basically suffering from a phenomena called as poverty of aspiration. To understand that, let's have a quick look at the kind of extreme wealth inequality which exists in our country. If we refer to the official data which is provided to us, so that we calculate on the basis of consumption expenditure as calculated by the Tendulkar Committee of 2011, which basically said that, let's say for example, if there is a person who is earning a huge income of 33 rupees per day, that basically leads to 990 rupees per month in urban areas and 27 rupees in rural areas, that basically means 810 rupees per month in rural areas. If you are just earning one more rupee than this in urban and rural area, then according to the government data, you are actually above the below poverty line. Then if you refer to the World Inequality Lab report 2024, it basically called a kind of our country entering into a billionary raj altogether, where 1% rich population of the country currently holds 22% of the national income and 40% of the wealth share. So for example, if we refer to the classification provided to us by the World Bank, we currently rank 139th in the per capita income despite being the 4th largest economy in the world, and thus we are basically tagged as a lower middle income country. To understand the poverty, let's refer to a more holistic data which is actually published by the Multidimensional Poverty Index of 2023, which basically calculates various indicators like, for example, educational attainment, health parameters, living conditions, etc. And on these 3 parameters, it basically said, the report in 2023, that currently 18% of our country's population is multidimensionally poor. So let's say for example, I belong to such multidimensionally poor population. You don't have to imagine, I am. So the idea is that if I'm belonging to this poor population, and if I want to kind of escape from this curse of generational poverty, the only way forward for me is the kind of transitioning phase of education, which can actually ensure me high income job, to get me some reputed job, or for example some government exam if I end up clearing it. So that will basically help me to kind of climb the ladders of socio-economic position in the society. Thus this attainment of education becomes very important. And let's say for example, I want to get admission in some private university, some very reputed but private institution. In that particular case, they have such exorbitant fees that I will unable to get the admission there because I am belonging to this multidimensionally poor basket. So that basically means that now I would be solely targeting for some government exam, coveted government exams, let's say for example JEE, NEET, etc. Or I would be targeting some government examinations like SSC and UPSC. And that has basically led to kind of over-competitive environment for the limited seats for these government institutions and jobs which exist, further propagating the idea of poster boy syndrome, where the people, specifically from the rural hinterlands, without understanding the amount of effort, the amount of sacrifices which a person has actually done to clear this coveted examination, the kind of attitude and aptitude which is required to clear the examination, they end up basically coming to these congested cities with lack of infrastructure and spend years of their formative phase of their life in a kind of a matchstick box size rooms. Thus kind of deprivation of various kind of facilities and opportunities which they could have actually kind of assessed over a period of time. Something called as poverty of aspiration. And then yes, obviously there exists the kind of evergreen dream of sarkari naukri or a government job, which basically offers you the external perks, let's say for example a kind of a second hand income which you can entail, or for example perks like high level of dowry which you can fetch in the market. So the point is, all of this also act as a kind of a attributing factor to a large number of people actually fighting for this limited seats which are available, and that basically creates a kind of a very tense competitive environment which actually prevails in our country. The point is that many of the time the people are not only driven by this popularity or this income factor, rather they also want sometimes to actually escape from the caste and the class predicaments which they face, and thus to avail the social mobility. So many of you will argue that sir, all of this caste and class based discriminations are a thing of past. Now we have actually become educated and we do not practice these kind of things in our daily life. But how many of you can actually attest to this fact that, let's say for example, if there is a domestic helper who is coming to work in your house, is that domestic helper is actually allowed to drink the tea from the same utensils which you guys are using? Or is that domestic helper is actually allowed to sit on the sofa while you are sitting on the sofa as well? And if not, then sometimes willingly and sometimes unknowingly, you are also practicing the same kind of structure of discrimination which has existed from the past, which is called as double tumbler system, a kind of a socio-economic issue which still prevails, that is deprivation on the basis of class. The second important thing is that let's say somehow I ended up clearing some examination and I enter into the second phase. There I face basically the leukemas of the education system in our country. So if we refer to the All India Higher Education Report of 2023, it basically says that only 21% of the institutions are actually managed by the government. Almost 78% institutions are private entities. The private entities which actually charges exorbitant fees. So for example, let's say I want to become a doctor. And if I end up getting a government medical college in Punjab, then that is fine. The annual fees is around approximately 4 lakh rupees. But if I am not getting such government college, then I will end up paying almost 12 times more than that, that is 58 lakh rupees per year to actually avail the very same course. In UP, the government colleges are charging 1.6 lakh rupees per annum, while a private college will end up getting almost 50 lakh rupees for the very same course. Obviously, the large section of the people, almost 18% of the population of our country, cannot afford this. The next major issue is the transition which we had thanks to our colonial legacy, that was moving away or transitioning away from value-based education system to the marks-based merit system. So for example, many of you actually live in this illusion that you studied by your choice. But actually the idea is that if you look back to your school life, you will end up realizing that there was basically a curriculum which was being taught to you. The curriculum which was designed by the government and implemented by the various boards like CBSE and ICSE. So they were basically telling you the books which you should read. You never had a choice to actually, let's say for example, opt for a specific subject in which you had the interest to do a specialization in that. So for example, over a period of time, by the time you ended up getting, certificate for class 12, somehow luckily and miraculously, when you come to the college life, you have very limited option or exposure to various careers. Most of the people end up basically applying for, let's say for example, engineers, doctors, etc. And this is where the whole education system is actually designed to judge your merit on the basis of marks itself. Thus, kind of a system which was actually imposed in our country through Charles Wood Dispatch of 1854, which was actually at that point of time was much more suitable to make Indians clerks at that point of time. Then over a period of time, these education institutions has actually kind of evolved into becoming a large impersonal spaces where the college teachers, professors, they actually have less expertise to actually deal with the kind of the psychological challenges which are being faced by the students who are actually going through various kind of mental health issues, and there exists lack of expertise among them. Many of the time, there exists no such kind of a system for counseling of the students, kind of taking review of their mental health. And when such kind of a tragedy occurs, that basically leads to tragedy occur action triggered approach in many of the institutions. The third is the personal level challenges, the mental health level challenges which is actually faced by the students. And I'm talking to you people as well. The first and foremost is that the rapid urbanization and the migration which has taken place, it has basically led to the loss of the social support structure which used to exist in the joint family, because we are now transitioning to the nuclear and neo-nuclear families. So when a person is basically kind of moving from his traditional village, from the joint family of which he was part of, to, let's say for example, in an unknown city, living among the unknown people, where they are basically most of the time basically kind of starts living in the silos of structures. So they start basically getting isolated from the larger care system which used to exist. Over and above this, the parents who does not have, let's say for example, much technical expertise about the mental health of the people, they start basically kind of applying insurmountable burden of expectations on their ward itself. I have taken this much loan from this bank to actually make you study here. So get first rank in the first attempt itself. Or for example, when I was studying, I used to cross the river. The river was infested with all the animals, specifically big crocodiles. Then you have actually got this luxury to live in such condition, get first rank. And thus there also exists a kind of an emotional support deficit for the children and the ward. Then we are basically living in the digitalized world. The kind of the emergence of huge digital penetration and the emergence of social media as an integral part of our life as well, which basically starts creating a kind of an echo chambers around us. For example, you go on YouTube and make a search about one random search about UPSC. Your algorithm will be flooded with UPSC videos. Over a period of time, when you are watching YouTube, you are watching basically nothing but UPSC related videos. Any social media you are using, you are basically being, let's say for example, flooded with the topper entry and topper exit videos. And all of that over a period of time starts creating silos of intrusive thoughts among the young mind, the formative mind of the young people. At the same time, we now also have access to the kind of the information across the world. So because of the digitalization, our world has become what? A kind of a small global village. And thus there exists a kind of an influencer economy. So while basically you are doing a lot of sacrifices for years, basically confined in the silos of your rooms, reading the same books again and again, you actually start seeing or you have access to the life of other people across the world. The life which is more vibrant and more attractive as well. So that basically start instilling in you something called as relative deprivation as well. And thus somehow if the youth actually ends up coming out from this education system, either they are not skilled enough to actually get the job. For example, as per the Economic Survey 2025, only 8.25% of the graduates were actually employed in the roles which were matching their qualification. Or for example, according to the India Skill Report, only 54% of the graduates are actually considered employable. Almost 47% are unfit for any type of industry job as well. So that is the kind of the huge skill gap which exists in our country. And that will basically translates into what? The ghost of unemployment. If we refer to the first ever monthly periodic labor force survey data published 2025, it showed the high level of unemployment rate which prevailed in our economy, almost 5.6%. Then there exist two major kinds of unemployment in our Indian economy right now. The first is cyclical. Why? Because of the lower demand. The kind of the K-shaped recovery which we are facing because of the pandemic overhaul which took place. The kind of the trade protectionism which is being followed by the countries across the world after the pandemic. The kind of the tariff wars which is basically existing right now. So if USA is imposing 50% tariff on our Indian products, it basically means what? The demand of the Indian product is going to decline in USA. And that basically implies what? The lesser the demand, lesser the required of output, lesser required of workforce as well. Large scale unemployment. Then obviously there exists frictional unemployment. Why? Because of the concept of relative deprivation. So now you have access to the kind of the jobs which people are doing across the world, the kind of the flexible workspace they have, the kind of the rights which are being provided to them. So if you have access to all of this, don't you think that you will basically kind of very much not motivated enough to actually do a kind of a small manufacturing job? That is frictional unemployment. And thus, even if somehow you make up your mind to go into this informal sector, the large informal sector which exists in our economy, you will basically facing no social security net at all. No coverage under Minimum Wages Act of 1948. No right to actually form a union under Trade Dispute Act. So basically all of this actually starts converting our youth from an asset to the liability, and you guys can see that in the rising suicide rate among the daily wage workers as well. Just look at the percentage share of daily wage earners in the number of suicides and how that has significantly increased to almost 25% of the total suicides which are being committed. And if you guys basically start creating this intrusive thought, these echo chambers around you, and your mental health starts deteriorating, and you want to access the mental health infrastructure in our country, then there exists another loophole. As per the World Health Organization, the burden of mental health problem in our country is almost 2,443 disability adjusted life years which are lost per 1 lakh of the population. If we refer to the National Institute of Mental Health, 80% people in our country, they do not have access to any kind of mental health care services. National Mental Health Survey data, there exists treatment gap for almost 70 to 90% of the mental disorders. And if we refer to the National Health Services data, we have 0.3 psychiatrists and 0.07 psychologists per 1 lakh population in our country, not even one. The government's policy paralysis further augments the issue. For example, there exists lack of public expenditure. The government of India anyway spends less than 2% of its GDP on the overall healthcare sector. Of this healthcare sector, the percentage of share which actually goes towards mental health is actually 0.05% of the GDP. Thus, leading to impacting the demographic dividend in three ways. First, individual, who faces immense personal anguish and distress, difficulty in maintaining personal and professional relationship, the increase out of pocket expenditure for mental health. And that leads to what? Reduced work efficiency. The issue of job shirking which we were discussing. Basically where you are disincentivized to do work itself because there exists no incentive for your work itself. Then decrease overall productivity. That basically starts denting the economy and thus denting the demographic dividend of India, which is integral to the concept of Viksit Bharat by 2047. So what are basically the steps which government has taken to actually kind of strengthen the mental health care infrastructure in our country and to prevent the issue of suicide? The first and foremost, the formulation of National Mental Health Policy 2003, where the modernization of state mental health hospitals took place, filling of the shortage of the qualified professionals were done. Second, Mental Health Act 2007, which decriminalized the suicide attempts for individuals with mental illness. National Suicide Prevention Strategy 2022, under which Kiran Helpline has been launched to provide the support to the people who are facing anxiety and stress. Manas app to promote mental well-being across the age groups. We have also basically adhered to the UN Convention on the Right of People with Disabilities, and under the National Education Policy 2020, there is also a system for flexible academic credit routine which has been provided. But what can be the suggestive measures which you guys should take or implement as the bureaucrat of the future? The first and foremost is to develop a machine to actually understand the mental pressure. That was on the lighter note. On a serious note, what we can do, first and foremost, we can actually take the cue from the steps which are implemented in the quota. Quota, which is basically famous for the preparation of the coveted examinations like JEE and NEET, and where exists an economy of almost 10,000 crore rupees. If we refer to the data which has been provided to us by the local administration, they basically kind of accepted that almost 50 students died every single year by the committing suicide. So in quota, what it has been done that in the hostels, there is now a kind of a suicide prevention systems which are being implemented. Like for example, in the fans, there are basically devices which are being installed. So that can basically prevent the student from committing any such extreme action. Or basically the grills are being put in the balconies itself, right? Basically the cages are being created there. Then sensitizing the people about the importance of mental health has been done there. So for example, there is an initiative called as Darwaje Pe Dastak which has been taken in Kota, where the kind of the hostel staff, the teachers, they basically kind of frequently interact with the students, try to create more personal relations with them so that they can share their problems as well. The counseling sessions has been created in the institutions, as well as the integration of mental health care has been done to the primary health care in the various primary healthcare centers in Kota as well. Also, as we are basically kind of reaching towards the end of this topic, if any of such students, all of you who want such, let's say for example, counseling sessions to talk about the mental health aspect in this UPSC examination, then please comment down. We'll create a proper link which will be shared with the students, and the students can join there and will sit and discuss about this very important aspect of the preparation as well. Try to solve this particular question and we move forward to the next news. So you guys can actually recall the landmark April 2025 judgment by the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court held that there exists no constitutional discretionary power of the governor to actually withhold the assent to the state bills, and also prescribed a kind of a specific time limit on the governor under which he shall or must act on the bills which are being passed by the state legislature, thus basically providing a kind of an opportunity or window where the kind of the grieved states, like let's say for example Tamil Nadu and Kerala, can actually approach the apex court, that is Supreme Court, on the breach of this timeline. In response to that, there was a precedent reference which was made under Article 143, where President basically asked certain questions to the Supreme Court under the advisory jurisdiction, which is mentioned in the Article 143. Now, when this particular issue is being held by the constitutional bench which has been formed, the central government has argued there that the Supreme Court shall not treat the governor as alien or foreigner, on whom such a specific timeline can be imposed or whose discretion doesn't count at all. So this particular tussle which is taking place between the state governments, the governors which are appointed by the president or the central government, this forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of issues related to federalism. So you guys know that there exist two important legislative bodies, the bodies which make the laws for our country. The parliament is the supreme law-making body in our country, and then there exists a state legislature which, following the principle of federalism, basically creates laws specifically for the states under the subjects which are listed in the state list in the 7th schedule of the constitution. Now, to understand the legislative power of the governor, let's first try to understand the concept of office of governor. So, under Article 153 of the Constitution, the governor has been listed as the chief executive head of the state. Remember that though he only acts as de jure executive and does not act as de facto executive. The reason for that is because the real power of governance actually lies in the state with Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Chief Minister. Right? The Council of Ministers, which basically forms the part of the legislature which is elected directly by the people. So basically this Council of Ministers forms the part of the people's representative. Now let's pose ourselves a question here. Let's say for example there is some extraordinary person like me, and can me as a person become the governor of more than one state? The answer is yes, and this was actually availed by the 7th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1956. So when our constitution makers were considering the appointment procedure for the governor, they basically referred to the Canadian model, under which the governor is directly appointed by the President of India under Article 155 of the Constitution. But some of you can argue that, sir, under Article 75 of the Constitution, the President works only on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Prime Minister. Thus, can we say that governor is nothing but the extended arm of control which is basically being imposed by the central government on the state government, and thus governor act as the agent of center? The Supreme Court very categorically rejected this interpretation in the Har Govind Pant versus Raghukul Tilak judgment of 1979. Where Supreme Court held that there are certain such specific duties which has been imposed upon the governor under the various constitutional articles itself, which basically implies that governor is an independent constitutional office and not an office of employment under the central government. So now you guys might be kind of inspired enough to become a governor. Who can become a governor? Under the constitutional provisions, under Article 157 of the Constitution, there are only two specific provisions. First, he shall be the citizen of India and he shall be at least 35 years of age. But there are certain conventions which has developed over a period of time, such as for example, he shall be outsider to the state where he is basically being appointed as the governor. And second, the president, while he is appointing such governor, he may consult with the chief minister of that particular state to kind of establish the federal relations. Now, what are these power of the governor to provide assent to the bill and why it is under the question or in so much heat? To understand that, let's understand the legislative power of the governor. The basic idea is that whatever the laws which are being made by the state legislature or for example by the parliament, they can become act only if they get assent from the president in the case of the parliament and from the governor in the case of the state legislature. This power basically draws the inspiration from the Indian Council Act of 1861, which basically held that any law which will be passed by the legislative body, the kind of a very small legislative body which existed at that point of time, any bill passed by such legislature will only become an act if it gets the kind of the assent from the viceroy of that point of time, thus kind of ensuring a central say in all the kind of legislature. The same law has been basically kind of derived in our constitution as well under Article 200 of the constitution. So let's say, for example, first there is an ordinary bill. When such ordinary bill comes on the table of the governor and it has been passed by the state legislature and the state legislative council in some cases, then the governor has four options. First, just like president, he has three options. He can give the assent to the bill. Congratulations, the bill will become an act. Second, he can withhold the assent, so he can completely reject it. Third, he can return the bill for the reconsideration of the legislature, that no, I did not like this point A, can you consider this again? Or fourth, he can basically reserve the bill for the consideration of the president. Now, let's say, for example, if the governor is sending the bill for the reconsideration of the state legislature, or the same is being done by the president to the parliament, and let's say the parliament and the state legislature do not make any changes and passes the bill with the same majority with which the bill was passed earlier, even such reconsidered bill by the parliament and state legislature actually becomes binding on both president as well as governor, and this was basically kind of enacted in the constitution under the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1978. Then let's say, for example, there is a money bill specifically dealing with the provisions of Article 110 in the constitution, right? Then what will happen? Or Article 199 in the case of state legislature. Then just like president, the governor can give the assent to the bill or withhold his assent. In this case, both president and governor cannot send the bill again to the parliament and state legislature for the reconsideration of it. Why? So remember, whenever the money bill comes, the reconsideration power of president and governor, they basically goes out of the window. So if you will give money to me, if I'm an honest person, I will say, no, I do not want. If you will give money to me and I'm basically like most bureaucrats and politicians of the country, I will definitely say yes. But when money comes in, I will never reconsider about it. In the governor case, in the case of money bill, he has another power, and that is he can again reserve the bill for the consideration of president. Any such bill which has been reserved for the consideration of president by the governor under Article 200, the power of president has been defined under Article 201, where president can again give the assent to the bill, withhold the assent, or return the bill in the case of ordinary bill for the state legislature, or, and again remember that even in the case of money bill of a state legislature, the governor cannot return the bill because it is the nature of money bill. The point is there any such timeline earlier which was imposed on both president and governor to decide on these bills, to give assent, withhold assent, reconsidered advice? There existed no such timeline. Thus, there existed basically a kind of a huge pocket veto. Now, under what circumstances it becomes actually obligatory for the governor to reserve such bill for the consideration of the president? So, Article 200 specifically says that any such bill which actually endangers the position of High Court in the state, the governor shall reserve such bill for the consideration of president. So, there is a kind of a constitutional discretion which has been provided, but that is a very specific one. Only if the bill is endangering the position of High Court. But again, there lies a lot of ambiguity because it has not been defined. And because if it has not been defined, it basically, kinds of become on the whims and the fantasies of the governor to basically reserve the certain kind of bills for the president itself. Then there are certain other circumstances which are not written in the constitution but kind of developed as a convention. Like for example, if bill is against the provisions of constitution, if bill is opposing any kind of directive principle of state policy, if it is against the larger interest of the country or of the grave national importance, or if the bill is dealing with compulsory acquisition of property under Article 31A of the Constitution. Remember, as we were discussing, there exists no such timeline which has been prescribed for the governor to make a decision with regard to a bill. And thus, it has often been misused to delay some important state legislation, a maneuver which is called as a pocket veto. And that is why it is said that the pocket of the president of our country is much bigger than the pocket of USA's president. Why? Because if a bill is passed by the USA's Congress and it reaches on the table of USA's president, let's say Donald Trump, he shall give assent within the 10 days. That is the idea. So there is a scribed time limit by the US Constitution itself. Again, when let's say for example we are talking about it, there existed a kind of a time period of 6 months which was prescribed for the state assembly to reconsider a bill by the president. So if the president sends the bill for the reconsideration of the state assembly, they shall basically reconsider it within the 6 months. But there is no such time limit for the president or the governor. And such prolonged delay in assenting the bill has actually become a source of confrontation, leading to the kind of policy paralysis between the opposition ruled state as well as governor. For example, let's take some example. There is Tamil Nadu state that was basically kind of alleging that the governor is acting as a political rival itself, creating a kind of a constitutional deadlock. Kerala alleged in the court that it is basically such kind of prolonged delays to give assent to the bill by the governor is actually defeating the right of the people because they are indefinitely sitting on the crucial bill. So after the pandemic got over, Kerala was basically trying to apply various kind of medical reforms, but it was unable to do so because the bill were not being passed by the governor of the Kerala. Same happened in the case of West Bengal, where they basically alleged that the state administration has kind of brought to a grinding halt itself because of such delays by the governor. Thus, taking the cognizance of such federal issue, Supreme Court in the landmark judgment in the month of April 2025, in the state of Tamil Nadu versus Governor of Tamil Nadu 2025, basically prescribed a specific timeline for the governor's decision on the bill. It said that let's say for example you are a governor and you want to withhold the assent to the bill or to reserve it for the president under Article 201 of the Constitution, then you need to do that within the 1 month. Or if you want to withhold the assent of the bill against the state government's advice itself, then do it within 3 months. To reserve the bill for the president against the state government advice, do it for 3 months. So let's say for example the bill will again go back to the state assembly, they can repass it and then that will become binding on the governor. To grant assent to the bill after it has been reenacted by the state assembly, you need to now give assent within the time period of 1 month itself. So now there is a prescribed time limit for governor as well as the president. And when the Supreme Court was basically kind of providing this judgment, it referred to various other precedents which was set by the earlier judgment of the Supreme Court itself, leading to the evolution of such timeline. For example, Supreme Court referred to the P. Nambudri versus State of Kerala, where the Supreme Court had earlier held that the constitution framers did not intended to for a bill pending assent to be at the risk of lapsing on the dissolution of the House. So obviously any such decision shall be taken within the 6 months. That was a kind of a directive given by the Supreme Court earlier. In D.P. Ghosh versus the State of West Bengal 1972, Supreme Court said or interpreted the phrase to mean as early as practicable without any kind of avoidable delay under Article 200 of the Constitution. Then there was a specific National Commission to review the working of the Constitution, which was created under the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government. It basically recommended that there shall be a time limit, desirably 6 months, to give assent or to reserve a bill, and that is the time period, right, where between the two sessions of the houses. Third, in K.M. Singh versus Speaker of Manipur Assembly, the Supreme Court has already established that there shall be a 3-month reasonable time within which the Speaker of the Assembly shall act on the disqualification petition. Under which law? Under Anti-Defection Law, which was added to our Constitution by the 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1985 to take action against the defecting MLAs. So when it has already set a deadline for the Speaker, it basically tried to apply the very same for the Governor. At the same time, the Supreme Court argued that there exists a kind of a limited discretionary power of the Governor by the Constitution itself. For example, in Shamsher Singh versus the State of Punjab, Supreme Court held that the Governor shall act only on the advice of Council of Ministers under Article 163 of the Constitution unless and until it has been very specifically written in the Constitution to go for discretion. Same was held in Nabam Rebia, that only those matter where the constitution very expressively permits the governor to act autonomously. Beside that, you should not act or challenge before a court of law. Then in the Rameshwar Prasad versus Union of India, it was held that the judicial immunity which is provided to the actions of the governor under Article 361, that is not absolute, and it can be challenged in the court as it is being done by the various state governments taking the precedent from this. So what President did under Article 143 of the Constitution, which basically authorized the President to seek the opinion of the apex court under the advisory jurisdiction. Now this advisory jurisdiction of Supreme Court is of two nature. Try to understand this. First, if there is any question of law or fact of public importance which has arisen or likely to arise, like for example this particular case of Tamil Nadu and Kerala going to the Supreme Court. In this particular case, Supreme Court may tender or even may refuse to tender its opinion to the President. That was actually being kind of demanded by the various state governments like Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Or if there exists any dispute arising out of the pre-constitutional treaty or agreement, then in this case it becomes kind of binding on the Supreme Court to give its opinion. But remember, it is at the end of the day opinion only, just like the opinion of your parents to study hard. This opinion expressed by Supreme Court is only advisory in the nature and in no way binding on the President. This power of reference which was made by the President basically draws its interpretation from the Government of India Act 1935. Various President has already invoked this power almost 15 times. When this power is invoked under Article 143 Clause 2, in case of an interstate dispute under Article 131, it becomes binding on President to actually refer the matter to the Supreme Court. Or under Article 145 Clause 3, if such reference has been made by the Supreme Court, then a minimum 5-judge bench shall be constituted. What the Solicitor General of India is actually arguing in the front of the court now under this presidential reference which has been made, he is basically saying that by taking or basically setting such timeline, this is basically an act which has been committed by the court in the way of judicial overreach. What is judicial overreach? It is basically encroachment into legislative and executive domain, or devising the mechanism which do not have any constitutional backing, like for example the basic structure doctrine devised by the Keshavanand Bharti case 1973. It did not exist in the original constitution. Or it leads to the violation of Article 50, which basically a directive principle of state policy which specifically states for the kind of the division between the judiciary and the executive. However, the retired CGI D.Y. Chandrachud had specifically said that if there exists some kind of humanitarian crisis, then the court shall not stand as a silent spectator, rather it shall follow the path of judicial activism. And that's why judicial activism basically implies to make justice accessible to the marginalized group, to actually uphold the fundamental rights of the people. And remember, when you guys would be writing the conclusion, you will write that how such judicial activism taken by the Supreme Court act as a bulwark against the arbitrary power of the executive. Keep the introduction and conclusion in your mind, attempt this particular question, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to analyze the kind of the status of the electric vehicles and its adoption rate in our country with a report which has been published. The report name is India Charging Report 2025, and that has been published by the Tata.ev, where it has said that how overcoming the range anxiety, the price barrier, the electric vehicle adaptation in our country and the adoption, the usage has been steadily rising in our country, with almost 50% of the electric vehicle car owners, they are making trips covering more than 500 kilometers now. So some important data to actually frame your introduction, like for example, right now such electric vehicles are present in 65% of the pin codes across country. 84% of electric vehicles are actually used as the primary vehicles by the owner. Then these electric vehicles are almost running an average 1600 km per month, almost covering 95% of the roads across the country. The public charging infrastructure has actually grown fourfold to 24,000, and almost 91% of the national highways now have the coverage of such electric charging infrastructure within the range of 50 km. So that is a good sign. First and foremost, why? Why our country is emphasizing so much on the electric vehicle adoption? The first and foremost is the environmental benefits which it offers to us. Like for example, if we refer to the vehicular emission by an internal combustion based engine, it basically emits almost 20 to 30% of the particulate matter 2.5. Or these normal passenger vehicles, they actually emit almost 4.6 million metric ton of carbon dioxide annually. And this basically leads to what? Pollution, so various kind of cardiovascular diseases for us humans, smog, emission of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, etc., as well as leading to what? The global warming. Why? Because these greenhouse gases, they act as a kind of a blanket to the kind of the extraterrestrial outward radiation. So it basically traps that. The earth starts getting heated. In contrast to that, these electric vehicles, they basically emit zero tailpipe emission, and thus they are integral also to achieve the Panchamrit target which we have set for ourselves, where we are saying that by the year of 2030, almost 50% of our total installed energy will come from the renewable energy. So we'll basically start kind of phasing out the fossil fuel. As well as by the year of 2070, we are going to become a net zero emission country as well. Then, this adoption of electric vehicles is also imperative for the energy security of our country. For example, if you guys can recall the kind of International Energy Agency report, India is almost 87% dependent on the import of crude oil. The majority of that which we are basically kind of importing from Russia. So basically we have a huge import dependency on crude oil. That can be basically phased out over a period of time if we are adopting more and more electric vehicles. At the same time, right now, because Russia has become the largest oil exporter to us, right? So because of that reason, USA, led by Donald Trump, has basically put 50% tariff on us. So don't you think that such tariff will eventually lead to what? This oil which we are basically importing from Russia, that is going to become costlier. And that will lead to the kind of imported inflation, and that will lead to logistic costs that will become higher as well. But if we are switching towards electric vehicle, it will save us from this imported inflation, because we will not be dependent anymore on the prices of crude oil, and thus the logistic cost will also decline. So our ranking of 38th in logistic performance index, that is going to significantly kind of improve as well. The products will become cheaper, the consumer price index will actually decline. Then we can actually kind of use in this electric vehicle charging infrastructure, we can source energy from the various other source of renewable energy, like for example solar panels, right, wind energy, and thus it can lead to the diversification of energy basket. And all of this saving which we are basically doing from cutting down our import of crude oil, don't you think it will significantly enhance our balance of payment and also save us a lot of forex reserves? At the same time, it is going to create a lot of skilled job. As estimated by the Niti Aayog report, it has potential to create almost 1 million skilled jobs by the year of 2030. Then, if we refer to the kind of energy consumption by an electric vehicle and by a normal internal combustion based engine which is basically running on fossil fuel like petrol and diesel. So, traditional liter per 100 kilometer to measure fuel consumption of internal combustion based vehicle is actually instead the kilowatt hour per 100 kilometer to understand the energy consumption for EVs. Now look at such internal combustion model and EV model, and look at the kind of the difference of almost 75% of energy was actually saved, 81% in this particular case. So basically it will lead to a lot of saving of energy as well. So what is the status of EV in our country? What is its contribution to the economic landscape? By 2024, India has become the world's third largest automobile market in the terms of sale. The industry valuation is specifically if you are talking about the electric vehicle, that is approximately around $100 billion. And these kind of automobile sales which we are doing, that basically forms 8% of our export and 7% of country's GDP, which can be further enhanced and kind of augmented by the integration of the electric vehicle. So what is the status of EV industry in this automobile sector? Almost 7% of the total vehicle which we sold in 2024, that was electric vehicles. It has a potential of $200 billion investment by 2030. And thus Niti Aayog has set a specific target for our industries to achieve, that is 30% penetration of EV in private cars by 2030, 70% in commercial vehicles, and 80% in 2 and 3 wheelers. So just see India's EV growth, which is expected to focus on 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, and by 2030 the kind of the integration which will take place in 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers as well as in the passenger cars of electric vehicle. But while we are discussing this, remember there also exists persisting issue. What are they? First and foremost, keep this in mind that as our country, there is a large section which basically falls in the bracket of middle class. So almost, if we refer to our country's total population, 30 to 35% of our economy basically falls in this middle class, and then 20 to 25% falls in the class of lower middle class. So basically, these people, they do not have that kind of higher income level to actually kind of afford a kind of a very expensive car. Thus, our country is considered as a price sensitive market. But if we refer to this kind of, let's say for example, electric vehicles, they already have high upfront cost. Look at Tata Nexon versus Tata Nexon electric vehicles. Look at the price differences which they have, almost close to 2 lakh rupees. So obviously it will deter the kind of the middle class and lower middle class to actually go for this electric vehicle in this case. And why electric vehicles have such high upfront cost? Because of the kind of the import dependency which we have for the rare earth elements like lithium, for example, for which we are completely import dependent on China. Then if we are buying the car, in our country we have almost 80% people who are still live in the kind of a joint family structure. So we require huge SUVs. And in this particular case, the customer safety is also kind of a very major factor when we are going to buy the car. Look at the kind of the cases which are basically kind of being reported when it comes to the electric vehicles in our country, right? Basically a kind of memes where these kind of scooters are being burned and people are like, oh, happy Diwali. Then there also exists the issue of range anxiety. So for example, these electric vehicles, they only offer, like after one particular charge, full charge, they only offer a range of, let's say, even 500 to 600 kilometers. But when you are with your family and you are traveling for a long distance, don't you think this will basically lead to the issue of range anxiety? And let's say for example, you and your friend, you both basically started, one of you were in Tata Nexon and one of you were in Tata Nexon electric vehicle. After 400 km, basically the battery level of Tata Nexon EV has basically come down. So this person will stop. First of all, that person will need to search a kind of a good sound charging infrastructure within the vicinity. If that is not found, then that is another problem. Then somehow, let's say for example, you reach to the charging infrastructure. Then whether you will be able to wait, let's say for example, there is a battery of 700 kilowatt hour. That will at least take 45 minutes to 1 hour to charge completely. Don't you think that will lead to huge time wastage as well? Then globally, let's say for example, if you're talking about the countries like USA, they have such a sound charging infrastructure that there exists a density of 100 people per one charging infrastructure. So that basically leads to kind of, let's say, less lines which are being done or less time wastage as well. However, such penetration even still remains low. For example, right now we are having 28 lakh vehicles. If we divide that by 24,000 charging infrastructure as being claimed by this report, then also there is a kind of a huge density per charging infrastructure, so that is also an issue. Then further, there exists a kind of a policy paralysis as the government has reduced the subsidy itself. So the government is saying, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry very recently said that we are basically going to reduce the 10,000 subsidy which we were basically giving for, let's say, a kind of a electric scooter. That will now come down to almost half to 5,000 rupees. So that is also a major challenge. So what are the steps which the government has taken in this response? The first is faster adoption of such electrical vehicle. The phase 2 has been launched, right? Where basically we are providing incentive on the purchase of electric vehicle, but keep this in mind, the subsidies are being reduced by the government to support 10 lakh two-wheelers, 5 lakh three-wheelers, to actually create more than 2,700 charging infrastructure in a grid of 3 km plus 3 km. Outlay of 10,000 crore has been provided for that. Then further, planned incentives are being created for, let's say, electric buses. Battery swapping infrastructure is being created. So there are some steps which has been taken by the government in this record that will become your way forward and conclusion. And we move forward to the next news. where we are going to read about certain freedom fighters which has been mentioned in the today's article, which actually fought for our freedoms not on the soil of our country but outside that. The article basically highlights that how against the backdrop of India's 79th Independence Day, there was a kind of a art gallery at Kamala Devi complex at the India International Center, which actually come alive with the voices from another time that basically fought, bled and sacrificed, and yet they are hardly registered in the annals of history that we know of. This particular exhibition was called as Hamara Itihas Archives of Freedom Fighter, which basically showcase the freedom fighters which fought for our country not in the streets of India but beyond the borders. Some specific mentions has been given in the today's article, such as for example the newspaper articles of Bande Mataram and Talwar, which was launched by Bhikaji Kama, that has been mentioned. The same Bhikaji Kama who basically furled the flag of Indian independence on 22nd of August 1907 at the International Socialist Conference in Stuttgart, Germany, which was actually based upon Calcutta flag. Then it talks about the first provisional government of India, which was created in the Kabul in 1915 by Mahendra Pratap. So basically, who were these people who were going, outside in the country at that point of time? They were basically either, let's say for example, students who were basically going to study abroad. Like for example, there was your Tarak Nath Das, who actually went to study in Canada. And when the Canadian government at that point of time, which was under the dominion of the British rule, they started basically putting various kind of restriction on the immigration of the Indian students in the region of Canada. Then it was Tarak Nath Das who basically launched kind of a newspaper which was Free India, as well as Circular A Azadi, where he basically talked about the rights of Indian students abroad. Or for example, it was basically Indian teachers like Shyamji Krishna Verma. Shyamji Krishna Verma, who established India House in London. He also used to publish a monthly journal called as Indian Sociologist, which used to criticize the British rule. Remember, he was the first president of Bombay Arya Samaj, and he was basically teaching Sanskrit at the Oxford University at that point of time. It is this very same India House which actually became a hub for the revolutionary activity of the Indians on the British soil. So at this stage, you guys can actually recall about the Nasik conspiracy case of 1909, which you guys often read, where there was a person whose name was Madan Lal Dhingra. Madan Lal Dhingra, who basically ended up assassinating Curzon Weil, who was basically a colonel. So Madan Lal Dhingra basically kind of misunderstood his identity as of Lord Curzon, who had done the partition of Bengal. So he ended up killing Curzon Weil at that point of time. And in this particular Nasik conspiracy case itself, V.D. Savarkar, who was also residing in the India House at that point of time, was actually arrested and sent to the Kalapani or the cellular jail in Andaman and Nicobar. So this India House also holds a lot of importance in our country. And remember, all of these activities are taking place in the backdrop of the First World War, which started. The kind of the formation of the Gadar Party, the Komagata Maru incident. And thus there were a lot of Indians who were basically kind of associated with this revolutionary activities which was taking place at that point of time. One such person was your Mahendra Pratap, who at that point of time was living in Kabul, Afghanistan, where along with the Maulana Barkatullah, he established a provisional government of Free India in 1915 in the region of Afghanistan. And they basically wanted the Emir of Afghanistan at that point of time to take the support of Russia and do a kind of an armed invasion in India. And for this purpose, they were basically kind of supported by the Indian Independence Committee as well. Indian Independence Committee, which was now created in Berlin, Germany. Remember, Germany was also fighting against the Britishers in the First World War. So that was created in the Berlin by people like, for example, Virendranath Chattopadhyay. They basically wanted to kind of, let's say, bring arms in our country and create a kind of an armed revolution in the region of Punjab and Uttar Pradesh. However, they were not that successful. Then the article specifically talks about the Indian National Army, where one of the exhibition most striking section actually focus upon the Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose Indian National Army and its Rani of Jhansi regiment. So basically this Indian National Army, the idea was first conceptualized by a Indian prisoner of war which was caught in the region of Singapore by the Japanese army at that point of time, which was fighting against the Britishers, if you guys can remember. So he basically formulated this idea of kind of including all the Indian prisoners of war and create an Indian National Army from the prisoner of war in the Malaya region. And this idea was supported by the imperial officer of the Japanese army at that point of time, Iwachi Fujiwara. However, over a period of time, 40,000 prisoners of war basically kind of, created a kind of an Indian National Army under Mohan Singh. Mohan Singh wanted training for them, resources for them, weapons for them to fight. But British, kind of Japanese, they only wanted this small Indian army as a kind of a token army, just for the symbolic purposes. So there existed kind of differences, and Mohan Singh refused to align with the Japanese policy, thus led to the disbandment of the first Indian National Army. Then this idea was again revived by a person named as Raj Bihari Bose. The same Raj Bihari Bose who was also involved in throwing bomb at Hardinge in the year of 1911 when the capital was being shifted to Delhi, and he was charged and fled the country under the Delhi-Lahore conspiracy 1912. Then he also took short participation in Ghadar conspiracy. Then in 1942 he basically kind of added the same Indian prisoners of war and created the Indian Club of Tokyo 1942. And in the Bangkok conference, he basically declared independence for India League, for which purpose Japan gave him a kind of a symbolic award, Order of Rising Sun, and it was him who basically recommended for the leadership of Subhash Chandra Bose for Indian National Army. Subhash Chandra Bose, who by the year of 1942 had become a kind of a national leader of a national stature. For example, his role in the creation of Independence for India League under the, let's say for example, the Calcutta session of 1928, which he formed, he, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subramaniam Iyer, all of them basically gave the call at that point of time for Purna Swaraj or complete independence. Then he became the president of Congress for 2 times, first in Haripura session of 1938 and then in Tripuri session of 1939, after which basically he resigned from the presidentship of Congress because of the kind of the ideological differences which prevailed between him and Gandhi. Thus, by the year of 1939, he has basically put on house arrest, from where through the route of Afghanistan he fled to Germany, where he created Azad Hind Radio, Free India Center at Berlin, gave the call of Jai Hind from there. It was the prisoners of war in Dresden, Germany, who first called Subhash Chandra Bose Netaji. And he kind of included these prisoners of war and created Free India Legion there. From there, he basically joined this Indian National Army in the region of Singapore and called it Provisional Government of Free India. On 6th of November 1943, when Japanese basically kind of captured Andaman and Nicobar Island, they handed it over to the Provisional Government of Free India of Subhash Chandra Bose, where basically he named Andaman as Shaheed and Nicobar as Swaraj, as it has been done by the current government as well. In January 1944, the headquarters of this Provisional Government of Free India or Hukumat-e-Azad-e-Hind was shifted to Rangoon, from where he gave that famous "Give me blood and I will give you freedom" speech and gave the call for Delhi Chalo. In April 1944, it was Colonel Malik who hoisted the flag at the Moirang, Manipur on behalf of Indian National Army. However, with the failure of Imphal campaign and with the withdrawal of the Japan from the World War II because of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Subhash Chandra Bose basically kind of met his fate through the airplane crash which took place in Formosa, Taiwan on a fateful day of 18th of August 1945. Today's article also highlights about several women's effort in the freedom, like for example Gauri Sen, who signed a petition in the blood when the regiment was disbanded after the death of Subhash Chandra Bose, or Rasamma Navratnam, who was basically persuaded by the Captain Lakshmi Sehgal, who was the commander of Jhansi Ki Rani. 4 such regiments existed, which was named by Subhash Chandra Bose: Jhansi Ki Rani, Nehru Regiment, Patel Regiment, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and Gandhi Regiment. 2 more names which you should remember. The first is Yamuki, who had actually escaped the unwanted marriage to die for a cause and fought for Indian National Army. And Sushila Nair, who basically hoisted the tricolor flag in the Lahore's women's jail in 1942. So we had tried to basically very succinctly tell you about the Indian National Army, not going into the details. Keep all of these factual points in your mind for the prelims examination. We move forward to the next news. where we are going to talk about the regulation of online gaming. Why it is in the news? Because as per the chief economic advisor, Indians' spending on online game is not anymore particularly small. Because the data which has been given to us by the National Payment Corporation of India, it actually showcases the kind of the payments which has been made via the unified payment interface in various categories. And such UPI payments on digital games has actually averaged over 10,000 crore in the first 4 months of 2025 to 2026. Just look at the average person to merchant payment through UPI, that is 593. And when we talk about the average online games UPI payment, that is almost close to 287 rupees. So basically, online gaming has actually emerged as a kind of a huge economic market with huge prospect for growth in the future. What is the status of online gaming in our country? The estimated valuation itself is more than 33,000 crore by the year of 2028. India is actually basically kind of thriving towards becoming a 1 trillion digital economy, and thus the gaming sector can very significantly contribute in that. The sector which after the pandemic has got such a huge boost that it is basically experiencing a compounded annual growth rate of more than 28%. Taking that into the cognizance, the government is basically provided 100% foreign direct investment through the automatic route itself. And thus the sector has also basically attracted a lot of investors, basically raising funds of more than $2.8 billion. Thus, the sector is actually providing employment and has the perspective to provide employment of creation of more than 2.5 lakh jobs by 2030. And remember that it is basically kind of also promoting the financial inclusion, as in the gaming sector the female workforce has increased by more than 3,000%. All of this data has been sourced from a report by Observer Research Foundation. The same report which also highlight various kind of weakness and threat which prevails in the gaming sector. Like for example, lack of skilled talent, high technological and platform cost which exist, high compliance cost through the various regulations by the government, such as for example high level of GST which is being charged. Then there are several threats which this online gaming poses, like for example national security and integrity risk, because of the kind of the transfer of the data which can be done, or the money which can be actually kind of sourced through hawala channels to basically, let's say, fund various kind of illegal activities in our country, narcotics in our country. Second, the addiction and the user harms to the very young people of our country, the children's. Third, uncertain regulatory framework, the various unfavorable taxing provisions of the government, and the low investor confidence which prevails in the kind of the large scaling of this market in our country. So what are the steps which has been taken by the government of India? First and foremost, as per the Supreme Court judgment in the Varun Gambar case of 2018, the fantasy games has been now kept in the category of the skill games, and thus a kind of playing of that is not considered as illegal. So that has provided a kind of a boost to the gaming economy. Second, a kind of an animation, video games, various kind of comics. A task force has been created on that by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting for the skilling of the youth in that. Then there exists a intermediary guidelines and digital media ethics code rules 2021, which tries to basically kind of sanitize the particular reason. Then there exists a 30% income tax under the Income Tax Act of 1961, which the government is imposing. Also, the Advertising Standard Council of India is trying to promote the, prevent the promotion of gambling, even though you guys will actually see a lot of very famous personalities very openly kind of promoting various kind of gambling or betting apps in our country. Then we actually need to create a kind of an oversight committee for the implementation of the IT rules 2023. So keep all of this information in your mind and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to talk specifically about the Western Ghats and what basically constitutes these eco-sensitive areas. Why it is in the news? Because the Environment Ministry's Forest Advisory Committee has for now actually declined a project approval for Hindalco Industries bauxite mining in the Maharashtra's Kolhapur, citing that this region basically falls in the eco-sensitive zone of the Western Ghat. What is Western Ghat? So Western Ghat is a kind of a perennial mountain range which basically traverses 6 states of our country: Gujarat, Maharashtra, Goa. The longest range basically lies in the region of Karnataka, then Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So it is approximately 1600 plus kilometer long.
It starts from Tapi estuary here and reaches to the Kanyakumari here. There are some prominent gaps, 3 gaps, the Goa gap, the Palghat gap and the Shenkotta gap. Remember, this Western Ghats are one of the 43 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in our country and one out of 36 biodiversity hotspots as well. And they form a very prominent eco-sensitive area under the Section 3 of the Environment Protection Act of 1986, where there are certain activities which are completely prohibited, like for example, commercial mining, commercial use of timber, creation of any kind of polluting industry, major hydroelectric project or discharge of solid waste into the open river stream. But certain activities which are still very dangerous to the environment and ecosystem, but they are only regulated, like for example deforestation, establishment of recreational infrastructure, commercial use of natural water, laying down of underground cables or any drastic change in cropping pattern. So remember this classification because the statement can be made on this line in the prelims examination. So what are the schemes which the government has launched for the ecological restoration in the Western Ghat? Like for example, National Mission for Green India, Integrated Development of Wildlife Habitat. There exists your Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Planning Authority, CAMPA, Nagar Van Yojana, under which we are basically using Miyawaki method for urban afforestation, as well as MISTI for the mangrove and the shoreline habitat rejuvenation. Remember all of these schemes, you guys can use them in your answer as well, and we move forward to the last news of the day, where the scientists have actually discovered something which can significantly increase the rice production in our country and the sale of that as well. So for example, rice is the staple food for over half of the world population. Now before a rice grain can actually be made edible, the outermost layer of the husk covering it has to be removed. If we go for mechanical rollers, they actually abrade the layers in a process which is called as milling. And some of the rice grain actually breaks into the result. So that leads to basically the kind of the shortage in the production as well as, for example, the less sale in the market. Thus, the breakage actually increases in the grain that have a trait called chalkiness. Rice is said to be chalky if after milling, a large fraction of grains has actually extensive parts that are opaque rather than translucent. So what the findings of the research says? The finding says that such chalkiness is actually influenced by genetic factor as well as because of the heat because of the global warming. So the Yangzhou University in China has actually discovered a kind of a chalk9 gene that can actually control the chalkiness in the rice variety. For this purpose, they use the CRISPR-Cas9 biotechnology to cut the specific stretch of DNA and remove this gene altogether. So thus decline of the chalkiness itself, not breaking of the rice will take place anymore. This is important not only for China but our country as well. Because who is the world's largest producer of rice? That is China, but remember our country is the second largest producer as well. At the same time, very recently there was an article in Down to Earth which talked about that how China's biotechnology is actually redrawing the global pharma map, and there are some very important lessons which India shall derive from that as well. Because look at the companies, like for example American big companies like AbbVie, AstraZeneca, how they are basically signing the various deals with the China's pharmaceutical companies to actually avail the biotechnology. So basically we should also sign such agreement with China to actually kind of incorporate such emerging technologies that will be helpful for our industry and economy as well. And with this we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.